Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. I'm Rachel Wayner-Apter, the director of the New Jersey Division on Civil Rights. We are at a watershed moment that began in 2006 when Tarana Burke courageously began using the phrase Me Too to raise awareness around the pervasiveness of sexual assault and sexual harassment in our country, gained momentum in 2017, and has been a steady and unrelenting flood ever since. Because sexual harassment is an epidemic. It's an epidemic that affects people regardless of race, religion, gender, sexual orientation, gender identity or expression, or disability. And it's an epidemic that has been powered by silence. The goal of these hearings is to allow voices to be heard and stories to be surfaced. According to a recent survey by the nonprofit Stop Street Harassment, 81% of women and 43% of men have experienced some form of sexual harassment during their lifetime. That includes verbal harassment, physical harassment, cyber harassment, and sexual assault. And the Eeoc estimates that 75% of those who experience sexual harassment at work do not report it. Those are staggering numbers. The purpose of these hearings is to learn from people's lived experiences, to give voice to the experience of people around this state, and to allow all who have been impacted by sexual harassment to share their stories in a space that is both safe and meaningful. Safe because any person can provide testimony anonymously or can provide written comments anonymously on our website, and meaningful because we are using all of the testimony gained at these hearings to compile a report that summarizes everything we learned and makes policy recommendations for how we can move forward. How do laws need to change? How do businesses and organizations and agencies need to change? And how can we change the culture to ensure that no one has to fear for their career, housing, or participation in public life because of sexual harassment? Because hearings can promote action. 4 months after the New York City Commission on Human Rights held the first hearing on women's rights in 1970, the New York legislature took action. Shortly after the EEOC held the first hearings on sexual harassment in 1977, it set forth guidelines that were embraced by the U.S. Supreme Court, holding that sexual harassment is a form of gender discrimination under Title VII. This is true under the New Jersey law against discrimination as well. We at the Division on Civil Rights are charged with enforcing the law against discrimination. 2 weeks ago, we announced an almost $300,000 award in a case of egregious sexual harassment that was brought to us. I would like to ask at this point that all division staff members please stand up. Thank you. To everyone who is here, to all the people in this room, we serve you. Please seek us out. Please use us as a resource and as a partner. And if you want to discuss possibly bringing a claim to the division, please come and speak to us tonight. Thank you. Perhaps even more than individual enforcement actions, though, as I said, hearings can lead to change because they can uncover the depth and breadth of the problem. We want to acknowledge the bravery and power of the people who will be speaking here tonight and all of those who have shared their stories in the past months and years. We know that despite our best efforts, we will not be able to reach every person here tonight or throughout this process. For example, we know that low-income people, immigrants, domestic workers, LGBTQ people, and people of color experience sexual harassment at extremely high rates at work and at home, and oftentimes their intersecting vulnerabilities make it even more difficult for them to assert their rights and demand justice. So if you know of someone we need to hear from, please invite them to attend tomorrow night's hearing or to provide written comments anonymously at njcivilrights.gov/hearing or by email to forums@njcivilrights.gov. We will consider all written and oral comments as we formulate the final report. Finally, I just wanted to thank the New Jersey Coalition Against Sexual Assault, which has worked with us every step of the way to plan and coordinate these hearings, and the Rutgers Law School International Human Rights Clinic, whose students and director are here today, and with whom we will work to produce the written report. Now, I would like to introduce Attorney General Gurbir Grewal, the 61st Attorney General of the state of New Jersey, to give brief opening remarks. As a brief introduction, General Grewal has made addressing sexual harassment and sexual assault a key priority since taking office in early 2018. Last November, he issued the Attorney General standards for providing services to victims of sexual assault. to provide a set of 14 protocols that prioritize the needs and concerns of sexual assault victims in New Jersey. The standards, which had not been previously revised in 15 years, now ensure that victims are treated with respect and understanding in the days, weeks, and months after reporting an assault. General Graywall is currently hosting, along with 21 county prosecutors in New Jersey, community forums on local college campuses to address the topic of sexual violence. And he has opposed policy changes suggested by the federal government to Title IX that could discourage student survivors from reporting sexual violence and prevent schools from taking action against students who are accused of sexual assault. We are very lucky to have the Attorney General with us to share a few words.
Good evening, everyone. It's really an honor and a privilege to join you for tonight's public hearing. I want to thank you all for coming out this evening and for sharing your experiences and your stories and your testimony with us. I'd like to start by thanking and acknowledging the Director of the Division on Civil Rights, Rachel Weiner-Apter. To say that she has transformed in her short tenure at that organization would be an understatement. She's energetic, she's dynamic, and in the short time that she's led the Division on Civil Rights, we've done remarkable work. I'll give you one example. We issued our first guidance document ever in the history of the Division on Civil Rights. In the entire history of the division, it had never used its power to issue guidance. And recently, Rachel and her team issued guidance on hairstyle discrimination at the same time that it resolved the Buna wrestling investigation. I think that's a remarkable sign of things to come under Rachel's leadership, and I want to thank her and Aaron and everyone else who contributed to that guidance document. And all I can say is I know what's coming down the pipeline, and this is a new day for civil rights in New Jersey, and I want to thank and acknowledge Rachel for all of her work. And it's also nice to be back home, and I want to thank old friends who've worked with us on the issue that we're going to discuss tonight, as well as other issues. Helen Arcantu from the Ywca healing space. We've done great things together in the past, and I look forward to the continued partnership. And I thank you for being here this evening as well. Thank you. Tonight's event is being held in partnership with Ywca. I would also be remiss if I didn't acknowledge Patricia Teffenhart and the incredible work that Ywca does across this state, and really in partnership with us as well. Rachel mentioned some of this, but over the last 20 months that I've been Attorney General, we've had a great relationship with Ywca, and we've done some terrific things. For example, one of the early challenges that we had when it came to investigating cases of sexual harassment and sexual assault were the changes in Department of Education policies that were coming down the pike. Changes in rules and reversals from Obama-era guidance that would make it more difficult to investigate and to prosecute cases of sexual harassment and sexual assault on campus. But working together with Patricia and others in this room, the Governor's Coalition Against Sexual Violence, the Department of Education, the Secretary of Higher Education, we were able to put together something that I think really stood out when it came to pushing back against rule changes from DC, a concerted effort across all of New Jersey to push back against those rules. And we also led a coalition of attorneys general in that regard. So if Washington changes course and if those rules take effect, or if the Department of Education and Secretary DeVos does anything that makes it more difficult for victims to come forward when it comes to campus sexual assault, we stand ready to work with each of you in this room to push back. So I want to thank you for that initiative. And that's not all that we've done together. Rachel alluded to the changes in the guidelines governing the investigation of sexual assault cases. They had not been updated in, I believe, 15 years. And Patricia and others at the Attorney General's office sat together for about 2 years in conference rooms at the Hughes Justice Complex, poring over the old guidelines to figure out how in New Jersey we could really remain a leader in the investigation and prosecution of sexual assault cases. And I think the document that we put forward together is a model for the rest of the country to follow. And it wasn't enough for it to be guidance. We used our authority at the Attorney General's office our authority to issue law enforcement directives. And we issued a directive that made it binding on our local prosecutors and law enforcement in the state to abide by that victim-centered approach articulated in those guidelines. And as if all of that weren't enough, and as if all of that partnership and collaboration weren't enough, we're also working together, as Rachel mentioned, on an issue that's close to my heart, which is improving police-community relations. And that takes on many different forms. And what we did at the Attorney General's office is we created a program called the 2121 Project, 21 counties, 21st century policing. And each quarter, we require our county prosecutors to meet with community members in the community, not at the prosecutor's office, about an issue of mutual concern. And this quarter, they're meeting all across the state as young people come back to campus to discuss sexual assault, in particular, campus sexual assault. And not just to discuss the issue, but to inform students of their rights and to inform students of the processes that we adhere to when we investigate these most difficult of cases. And so it's my hope with those initiatives, with the type of partnerships that we have in this room, that will really push the state forward in that area and really change behaviors on campus as well. That brings me to tonight's program. That partnership continues tonight. As I mentioned, Rachel is taking an aggressive approach, to say the least, when it comes to the enforcement of civil rights laws in New Jersey. We have a powerful, powerful tool in the law against discrimination. But we need to hear from each of you in this room in public hearings like this one on how we can do more when it comes to combating sexual harassment. It affects, as Rachel mentioned, everyone, regardless of gender or gender identity, regardless of your socioeconomic status, regardless of your education level. It touches so many people in so many different ways, and we need to hear your testimony as we come up with a comprehensive plan to address the issue in this state. So I wanted to thank all of you who are going to share your testimony this evening for coming out, for being brave and sharing your stories, and for helping us collaborate and really together form progressive policy solutions on this most difficult of issues. So thank you so much for allowing me to share a few remarks this evening. I look forward to working with each of you, however I can, to make sure that we really do everything possible in this state to combat sexual harassment. Thank you.
Okay, if each of the other three panelists want to come up. I'm very excited to introduce the panelists for today's hearing. Patricia Teffenhart, Executive Director of NJCASA, Patricia Perkins-August, and Clara Fernandez, both commissioners on the New Jersey Civil Rights Commission.
Good evening, everyone. I want to thank the Attorney General for joining us this evening, and thank you for the strong partnerships that we've been able to establish and for the work that we've been able to do together. And honestly, the team that you have here at DCR is among some of the most precise and thoughtful experts we've ever worked with, and I mean that in there's no stone unturned. Everything that could potentially pop up is something that we've discussed in a way to really honor the importance of the work that we're doing together. This isn't the kind of thing that you can or should throw together in like a fly-by-night kind of way. And it's been reflected in the thoughtfulness and the venues that we've selected and the experts who are speaking and the comfortability of the community members who have given us really such a gift to share their experiences with us. And it's a real testament to your leadership that you have such excellent professionals working with you. And we are better for having had the opportunity to work with all of you. I want to be very brief because we have incredible testimony to hear tonight. But I would want to thank my colleagues who work at the local sexual violence service organizations across the state. I have the privilege as the Executive Director of the New Jersey Coalition Against Sexual Assault to work with those frontline providers that are providing 24-hour-a-day, 7-day response, 365 days a year. When someone calls a crisis hotline at 3 a.m. and needs someone to accompany them to an emergency room, it's the individuals at our local sexual violence service programs that provide that support. Someone needs counseling because they've just now identified that the trauma they've been experiencing for the last 20 years as a result of childhood sexual abuse. It's the counselors at our local rape crisis programs that provide that support. And I'm so thankful that few of you are here tonight to share the testimonies and to bring the voices of the survivors and the communities you serve into this room is incredibly important. I've had the privilege and the honor to hear from survivors throughout our state during my tenure here at the Coalition, and sometimes I get an opportunity to hear from people who have told no one else what they've experienced. Those who have sought justice and been denied, or those who have had their lives forever impacted by the actions of another human. And to the points that Rachel raised before about Me Too and Time's Up and how have given us incredible opportunities to amplify the voice of survivors, what I believe to be true is that sexual harassment is still greatly misunderstood and that its impact is too often diminished. And that's just a part of our culture. People taught to be polite when on the receiving end of inappropriate and uncomfortable comments. People conditioned to not speak up in fear that violence could escalate. And when they do speak up, being told that they're too sensitive or they're being dramatic or why can't you take a compliment? And the great thing about culture is that it can change. And one of the things that I love about having an opportunity to partner with the Office of the Attorney General under your leadership is that you talk about prevention, that this is not just a criminal justice response, this is not just a civil rights response, but that there's a shared collective responsibility to shift the norms that allow these kinds of acts to be so pervasive. And so, as we move through tonight's testimony, I just want to thank all of you for offering your perspectives, your lived experiences. The work that you do on the local level to support community members is invaluable. And the reality is that in order for us as collective partners in this work to make people-centered policy, we need to hear from people. And I want to thank all of you for the time and the grace that you're giving us tonight. It's an honor to be here.
My name is Clara Fernandez. I'm a Civil Rights Commissioner, and again, I just want to echo the same thing that has been said again and again. Thank you to those of you who have found the courage, who have found the support to come out and speak of your experiences, and also thank you to all the experts that are going to be sharing with us tonight so that we can see how this affects everybody from every perspective. It's not just the individual being affected, it's how the community, the family, the work life, everything else is affected. And we thank you for sharing that very difficult moment, that we may grow, that we may learn, that we may move forward, that we can make this, hopefully, I hope these hearings can make this in New Jersey like a sad memory of the past, but a view of a better future, something that we can have, like, what is it, justice for all that can really be, that can be a reality. So thank you for inviting me here, and thank you everybody for your testimony, your support, your wonderful work with the community. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. And my name is Patricia Perkins Auguste, and I too am a commissioner for the Division of Civil Rights. And I truly want to thank the Attorney General for understanding the need for New Jersey to understand that sexual harassment is a crime. That is something that we need to work towards in terms of eradicating in the workplace, even in the homes, in the community, even in the safe places that we deem are safe, on the football fields, whether we're in the churches. Sexual harassment has no boundaries, and I believe that the testimonies that we hear today, they're not just being heard just for, just to have, a way of just telling your story. It's more than that. We're going to take this testimony, we're going to prepare a report, and with that, we're trying to change the law here in New Jersey. So it's just not about us just coming out, listening to your testimonies and, just doing those things which make us all feel good therapeutically, but it's about changing the law. And it's about the legislation that really makes this really matter. So I thank you all who are here, who are working towards this end. And it's about changing laws in New Jersey so that we all can live here in a state where it's peace, free of sexual harassment, free of all types of harassment. The Division of Civil Rights has been around for almost 75 years. We'll be celebrating our 75th anniversary come 2020. And it's about real change for the 21st century. 75 years, what have we done? What will we do? And this is one of the things that we're going to be working on to change the laws here in New Jersey so that people can live here free and without any stigmas and without any discrimination, whether it be sexual, whether it be racial, whether it be whatever your ethnic, it doesn't matter. We're trying to make this work the way it should work and be a model for the country. Thank you.
Thank you so much to Patricia and to Clara and to Patricia. If your name is Patricia and you're offering testimony, we welcome you as well. Thank you so much to the Attorney General for his incredible leadership and for his vision when it came to these events and when it comes to everything that we're really trying to accomplish around protecting more residents under the law against discrimination and really working towards achieving the goal for equal rights to all New Jersey residents. So we are very excited to be here, and just a reminder, we will be transcribing all remarks and we are videotaping and web streaming the entire hearing live. Members of the press have also been invited to attend, but they have been instructed to not share any identifying information or images to protect the confidentiality of any person who chooses to speak, absent explicit written permission from that individual. So I'm now going to open it up for the individuals who came here to share their wisdom with us and their experience. First, I want to call on Marissa Centeno from the National Domestic Workers Alliance.
Good evening. Let me adjust this. My name is Marissa Centeno, and I am with the National Domestic Workers Alliance. I am our New York co-director, and I want to thank the New Jersey Division on Civil Rights and everyone who was involved in putting these hearings together. This is off the script, but I first testified at New York City's city hearing on sexual harassment in the workplace in December of 2017, and it's been a journey. And so I want to share with you tonight a little bit of what we have learned and what we're seeing and what we're recommending. So the National Domestic Workers Alliance is the nation's leading voice for dignity and fairness for the millions of domestic workers in the United States. Founded in 2007, NDWA works for the respect, recognition, and inclusion in labor protections for domestic workers, most of whom are women. The Alliance is powered by 60 affiliate organizations, and plus including our on top of our local chapters, which we have one in New York City, of over 35,000 nannies, housekeepers, and direct care workers amongst 36 cities and in 17 states. We are across the country. So who are domestic workers? There's 2.5 million nannies, house cleaners, and home care workers who go to work in our homes every day to make it possible for us to do what we do every day, knowing that our loved ones and our homes are in good hands. They're the nannies that take care of our children. They're the housekeepers that bring sanity and order to our homes. And they're the home care workers that care for our parents and give independence to people with disabilities. Domestic workers are mostly immigrant women of color, and they're some of the most at-risk and invisible workers in the nation. The challenges that plague domestic workers when addressing severe issues such as sexual harassment are the same challenges we face when addressing the issues of even the most basic workplace rights for domestic workers. They work in isolation. They do not have the power to collectively bargain. The power differential between an employer and employee is very high. And the home is not recognized by employers as a workplace. When addressing sexual harassment, workers are in a he said, she said scenario. There's no impartial party within the house and the home. And we have listened to accounts of workers who have been threatened when they spoke out, their claims dismissed by the police, and they told that they had no power in the situation, not coming forward under because of the statute of limitations, high fear of retaliation when employers are disgruntled or want to silence a worker, will refuse to provide recommendations and will blacklist a worker. This is extremely severe for domestic workers. If you can imagine, you probably wouldn't hire a nanny who didn't have a letter of recommendation or a glowing reference. And so it is extremely easy, and it is a very high burden on workers to be able to come forward in any sort of form of exploitation. And it becomes a very serious scenario when it involves sexual harassment. For workers who are labor trafficked, they may even face employers' impunity if the employer is a diplomat. And that's common enough here of an occurrence here in New Jersey and in New York City, the New York area. Sexual violence in domestic work is prevalent. There's no HR in that domestic workers can report to. So there are no spotlights and no microphones in front of them to share their story, and few laws on the books that can actually protect domestic workers from harassment and exploitation. Women and all people deserve to work in safe and dignified workplaces. And when women's workplaces are dignified, we see laws that include every worker, no loopholes, no exclusions. We see women have safe and accessible ways to report harassment where they're believed and their abusers are held accountable. Women don't have to choose between paying rent and their own personal safety. In the past 5 years, NDWA has worked with our local affiliates to explore the following strategies in pursuit of a more worker-led, community-supported enforcement process. We prioritize leadership development amongst domestic workers and prepare them and utilizes them as key actors in supporting their peers when coming forward in the enforcement process. I run a program which trains up worker leaders to go out into the communities to do screening and help us assess their eligibility for an enforcement and filing a claim. And they actually help to run the only domestic worker specific legal clinic that I know of in the region. We work with our advocacy group lawyers called Take Root Justice, and they also have, we are located in New York City, but their lawyers are also barred in New Jersey. So we're increasingly encountering workers who both live and work in New Jersey, and they come to us for support and help. We outreach to them, and we're also learning how to best provide support in this enforcement system. We work collaboratively with government agencies who share the values and vision alignment to explore how to leverage our collective resources and mechanisms to increase our capacity to bolster enforcement as a system and not just as an instance. We're strengthening sector-specific knowledge among government enforcement agency investigators, and it's very important to us that when a domestic worker encounters an enforcement agency, that they actually understand what is a domestic worker, what is their role, and who they are, because it's so key in being able to move forward in any investigation, especially for these highly vulnerable populations. Even with these strategies in place and continued collaboration, we see that it still takes a very long time for workers to come forward and to find out whom to trust and whom to turn to. Domestic workers have a very hard time admitting that their workplace rights have been violated, and they have an even harder time sharing accounts of sexual harassment, but continue living with the trauma and fear every day of their past experiences. We have been collecting data around the barriers that domestic workers face when trying to stop harassment in the workplace. We find that many domestic workers lack the knowledge of their rights and protections under the law. Likewise, many employers do not consider their home as a workplace, and so they are also unaware of their obligations. Filing in a timely manner is a large barrier for workers. In addition to those most basic barriers, domestic workers also face a different type of barriers in being able to, that dissuade them from filing altogether, such as fear of retaliation because of their immigration status, language barriers, fear of losing their job and not being able to support themselves and their families. So I come to the section where I would like to address some of our recommendations. We find that New Jersey needs to include domestic workers in its statute of law against discrimination, striking out its exclusion. So we found that in New Jersey, domestic workers are specifically excluded from many labor rights and protections. So any current exclusions need to be remedied immediately because they perpetuate racial and gender inequities, and they have no place in the modern workplace. 9 other states, plus a municipality, have decided to cut those ties to institutionalized racism and have passed domestic worker Bill of Rights. New Jersey can do that as well. So we would like for you all to extend the statute of limitations to be able to file sexual harassment and discrimination claims. As a comparison, New York has extended theirs to 3 years, New York City as well. So it's key to understand that where possible, having the cities and municipalities access to be able to file claims is actually really important for workers to being able to have access as well. So we know that workers have access at a state level, but having it at the city level is really key because they're able to access their city agencies much easier. We want to support a New Jersey Domestic Worker Bill of Rights because addressing root causes of discrimination is some of the best ways to prevent harassment. Finally, I want to finish with giving you an account of a worker that I worked with. She lived in New York City, and she was hired through an agency that placed her in New Jersey. It's a very common occurrence. So there is almost transit of workers, especially amongst workers who are from newly arrived or newly established kind of immigration patterns. For example, Nepali, Tibetan communities. So we have these sort of pockets of ethnic communities that will place workers in these other pockets of ethnic communities. And they are out of sight, out of mind, because they don't have the access to language, they don't have access to information. And so for the worker who came to us, she was actually brought to us by one of our worker leaders. She was a live-in worker, and she had to work very long hours and was paid less than minimum wage. And the employer in the home, the man of the house, would repeatedly make rude, sexually suggestive gestures towards her, and would make extremely inappropriate comments against her of the sexual nature. And she always felt uncomfortable and somewhat unsafe in that situation. But because she was paid so little, she could not extricate herself from that job. It turned out that she severely injured herself while taking out the trash one day, and she broke her leg. And the employers took her to the hospital, brought her back to their home, and while she was in a cast, would have to sit on the floor, and they put her in charge of watching the baby. This was her recovery time. She was trapped. She couldn't move to get herself out of this home. She didn't have the money to call and ask for someone to come and get her. And she was in a situation where a harasser was constantly trying to insinuate inappropriate things to her. That was her recovery time. She was never paid for that time. So by the time she was able to get out of that employment situation, all of these problems that were arising because of her health, because of the lack of payment of wages, really took much more precedence over the sexual harassment. And so she was never able to come forward in regards to filing a claim for sexual harassment. And she's still fighting for justice today about the unpaid wages. I hear a lot of stories. I was the enforcement program manager, and I work specifically on organizing domestic workers around enforcing their rights. And so what we know is that once we start to build the infrastructure and ecosystem, we're then ready for workers to be able to come forward with its claims. And it requires a co-enforcement mechanism. It requires for governmental agencies to work with community centers and workers themselves to be able to establish that environment of support. So I'm also, there's a lot of recommendations that I have there, but this is one that I know specifically of how to use co-enforcement as a mechanism for helping workers seek justice. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marissa. Deborah Lancaster, Executive Director of the Center for Women and Work at Rutgers University.
Good evening. Thank you to the DCR and to the New Jersey Coalition Against Sexual Assault for making time and space for these hearings and for making sexual harassment in employment, housing, and places of public accommodation a priority. I'm honored to be among those testifying here tonight, especially those who are here to share their direct experiences of harassment and those who advocate on behalf of victims. My name is Deborah Lancaster, and I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Women and Work at Rutgers University. We engage in research and evaluation, education and program development, and technical assistance with the goal of advancing understanding and making progress on economic and social equity and justice for women, families, and communities. I'm going to focus on the economic impact of sexual harassment this evening. I also think it's important to note, just for a moment, a couple positive things where New Jersey leads, and that's why I believe that we can lead on this as well. The bright spots we have when it comes to economic justice and policies that support women and working families. I'm referring to policies such as the recently passed earned sick time legislation and New Jersey's paid family leave legislation. New Jersey also has some of the most progressive equal pay legislation in the country. These are important steps toward encouraging gender equality, and so is preventing and mitigating the impact of sexual harassment. Sexual and gender-based harassment is pervasive. Me Too and hearings like these give voice to the statistics, which remain alarming. 1 in 3 to 1 in 4 women, to as many as 85% of all women, and we know there's men in there as well, depending on the sampling strategies and definitions, experience sexual harassment. Sexual and gender harassment cuts across all industries and levels. It happens in academia, it happens in our homes, as we just heard, Hollywood, corporate America, government, on construction sites, in hospitals, human services, law enforcement, logistics, retail, and hospitality, small businesses and large. Sexual harassment can come from supervisors and managers, but also coworkers and third parties like clients, customers, patients. There are large numbers of workers who are not protected by existing laws and a few avenues for reporting harassment. And those who do have avenues to report seldom do for fear of retaliation and other negative outcomes or consequences. Sexual harassment hurts women's health. We have the research that demonstrates that sexual harassment causes harm to mental and physical health and overall well-being, anxiety, depression, poor sleep, high blood pressure. Sexual harassment harms women's careers. It hurts the productivity of organizations and individuals through turnover, absenteeism, and early retirements. Sexual harassment is associated with reduced job satisfaction. Women who experience sexual harassment are more likely to change their jobs to avoid their harasser or because of frustration with their employer's response or lack of response. This type of job change often creates financial stress and can interfere with career advancement, particularly early in your career. Sexual harassment is a contributing factor in the gender wage gap. When we compare all men and women who work full-time, women typically earn 80 cents for every dollar their male counterpart earns. Women's Equal Pay Day is a symbolic date on which women's earnings nationwide catch up to men's earnings from the previous year. For all women, this was back on April 2nd. For Black women, Equal Pay Day is August 22nd. For Latino women, it won't be until later this fall, November 20th. In New Jersey, Black women earn just 50 cents for every dollar white non-Hispanic men make, and Latino women earn 42 cents for every dollar, putting our state near the bottom in terms of lifetime losses incurred due to the wage gap. In New Jersey, if you are a woman, African American, or Latina, you are much more likely to be struggling in a low-wage job in retail, hospitality, or in healthcare. You may be a domestic worker, working as a cleaner, nanny, or home health aide. Meeting basic needs on the front lines of these industries is a true struggle. If you are a low-wage earner and a mother, you are trying to keep your kids safe and healthy and fed while you figure out juggling work and the bills. Maybe your immigration status makes you even more vulnerable. Now imagine on top of this, you are also confronting sexual harassment in your workplace from a boss or coworkers or customers. Workers in these low-wage, female-dominated industries have the highest reported incidence of sexual harassment and assault by sector. We need to have a multi-pronged approach to addressing the wage gap, not only because it is right and fair and will lead to a stronger economy and stronger and healthier communities, but also because strengthening women's economic opportunities and self-sufficiency are important strategies for sexual and domestic violence prevention. One of these prongs needs to be focused on preventing and addressing workplace sexual harassment. The EEOC has identified 5 core principles that can be effective in preventing and addressing harassment: committed and engaged leadership, consistent and demonstrated accountability, strong and comprehensive harassment policies, trusted and accessible complaint procedures, and regular interactive training tailored to the audience and organization. This is not a problem that will be solved through check-the-box compliance training and zero-tolerance policies. In fact, research has demonstrated some of those approaches can actually make the problem even worse. There is no quick fix to preventing sexual and gender-based harassment. It is going to take changing our culture in the workplace, and adapting legal structures that are more inclusive of all workers. It is also going to take developing a better understanding and prevention strategies to protect workers who confront sexual harassment from third parties like customers and clients. It is going to take meaningful implementation of bystander intervention training that views everyone as a potential ally in preventing and combating sexual harassment and gives them the tools and skills to address harassment. Women who have shared their voices and experiences through Me Too, as well as those who came before them, have done their job. We need a commitment of resources and investments from a range of stakeholders, including government, employers, and private foundations, to address not just understanding in this area, but to advance prevention strategies through research and implementation science. We need to harness the evidence that does exist on what works and make it accessible and actionable as if this is the public health crisis that it is. Thank you.
I want to call up person number 2. We're calling certain people up only by number so as to preserve their anonymity.
As my coworker said, we've been through quite a few hearings, but every time we do this, it triggers memories. I'm going to try my best. I represent the National Domestic Workers Alliance. I am an organizer. I was a domestic worker also, but I'm also a survivor. The first time I ever experienced sexual violence, I was 16 years old. I had gotten a job to help my mom, my single mom, financially. I was new in the country. I barely spoke the language. I actually didn't know anything. And I was excited because I was helping my mother financially, given the fact that she was a living worker, domestic worker. So that I could spend more time with my mother, which I was only seeing her every Sunday for 3 to 4 hours. So me working meant that maybe I was having a better chance of seeing my mother a little longer. So having that job was going to help me. So I took the job. I was in high school, and it was a part-time. Usually after school, I would go and take care of a 3-year-old boy. The reason I got it was because the mom spoke Spanish, but the dad, I guess we didn't have to somehow communicate. The idea was just for him to come home, and for the minute he walked in, I will have to leave. But that's how it was in the beginning. But after a while, he started acting weird. So he would come home and tell me to wait while he was taking a shower. So I was like, okay. Then things started getting a little weird, where he will ask me, bring me the towel to the bathroom, to the door, and okay, I forgot it, fine. Then I will do, there are days when before he will come home, I will leave the towel in the bathroom and then just head out. You know, you kind of plan before. But he would just keep calling my name. And since we couldn't communicate, it made it harder for me to say something because I wasn't feeling comfortable at that moment. Then one day, he came home earlier. He went straight to the bathroom. He called me again. This time, I guess I was busy, I don't know. I forgot to put the towel in the bathroom. And then he called, and I brought it. But then as I was walking back, he started following me to his room, where his son was. And it was a small apartment, too. And when he got to his room, he began to touch me and sexually harass me in front of his son. At the moment, I couldn't say anything. Like I said, the language was a huge barrier between us. But I don't know, something happened. Someone knocked on the window, and suddenly he got distracted. That was when I was able to take off and kind of just left the house and never ever went back. That was 19 years ago. I never told anyone, and not even my mother, because I was ashamed. I felt like it was my fault. I was only trying to help. And I feel that I wish I could have had someone, an agency, someone, somewhere to go and tell them this happened to me. But at that time, honestly, there's nothing. And even till this day, I don't think there's not enough information, at least on my side for domestic workers, given the fact that, like Marissa mentioned, we work in isolated places. Now, as an organizer, I speak to a lot of them, and they live, like I said, status is a huge problem, language, not having the access to any of this information, sometimes in their own language. And the same thing, it took me 19 years to talk about it. And I guess the organization made me realize that I wasn't the only one. I was only 16, but it wasn't the only time that happened. It happened when I was working as a waitress. it happens on the streets. And now I'm a mom. My daughter is 7. I don't want my daughter to go through that again. And I'm sure none of you here want their kids to hear this story. So I'm here on behalf of domestic workers. My ask is for you to include us. We always get excluded from every law out there. All I'm asking is for when this moves forward, please include a domestic worker, a house cleaner, a nanny, a care worker. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your incredible courage. Christine Farrow-Saxon, Executive Director of Family Service League SAVE of Essex County.
Hello, my name is Christine Farrow-Saxon, and I'm a licensed clinical social worker. I have been providing counseling and advocacy services to survivors of sexual violence for the past 12 years. Since 2014, I have served as the Executive Director of Family Service League SAVE of Essex County, located in Montclair, New Jersey. Family Service League consists of 2 programs: a counseling program providing individual, couples, and family counseling, as well as SAVE of Essex County, the designated sexual violence program for Essex County. As part of the county's sexual assault response team, SAVE provides a 24/7 emergency hotline, crisis intervention advocacy services at all medical and legal proceedings, prevention educating programming, and counseling services. In 2018 alone, we provided crisis intervention advocacy services to 192 survivors at hospitals and police stations. Additionally, we provided over 1,300 counseling sessions to survivors of sexual violence and significant others. The majority of the survivors we serve seek our services when a physical act of sexual violence is perpetrated against them. However, in listening to the stories of these survivors, some of them have experienced months or even years of harassment before the physical acts of violence began. In 2019 alone, we have had at least 10 survivors report, and I have to say report because we know that sexual violence is one of the underreported crimes in the country, as well in the state of New Jersey. They reported that they experienced sexual assault by an employer in housing or in someone in power over them, such as a prison guard or athletic coach. All of these cases started with some form of sexual harassment. Working in a local restaurant for about 3 months as a dishwasher, one survivor found himself being sexually harassed by his supervisor. The harassment started as comments about his body and then escalated to unwanted touching and then sexual assault. He was told by his supervisor that if he did not comply, she would contact the authorities to deport him and his family. He was sexually assaulted every night for weeks. A nude picture of the man was taken as part of the scheme to blackmail him if he went to the police. He stopped eating, couldn't sleep, and it wasn't until his sister noticed the changes in him that she persuaded him to seek help. In most cases, survivors who are undocumented are even less likely to seek help out of fear of deportation. Because of how men are socialized and expected to behave in our society, survivors who identified as men are also less likely to seek help than those who identify as women, out of fears of embarrassment, not being believed, and not being seen as quote-unquote a real man. Another survivor that sought services through the sexual assault response team in our county was sexually assaulted by a man that she was renting a room from. The harassment began as unwanted sexual advances via text messages, via phone calls, and then in person, and then escalated to her being forced to perform oral sex on him when she was unable to pay her share of the rent that month. When the survivor attempted to tell him that she would be moving out if the assaults did not stop, he vaginally and anally sexually assaulted her. Although she was aware that she would have no place to live, leaving her homeless, She courageously sought help. As in most cases of sexual harassment in housing, fears of having no place to live keep survivors silent. We have all heard of the old saying that it takes a village to raise a child. The same holds true in the prevention of sexual harassment and sexual violence. For a change truly to occur, our village must consist of law enforcement, Department of Labor and Workforce Development, Division of Housing and Community Services, New Jersey Division on Civil Rights, Department of, statewide and local nonprofits providing direct services to survivors, and survivors themselves, all working together to ensure that all sexual harassment survivors understand their legal rights and options. We find that people just don't understand what they have rights to and what could be done to help protect them. So I recommend that awareness events, social media outreach, media campaigns, such as radio or TV ads, sexual harassment survivors can be reached and educated about their rights and where they could seek help. In addition, it is very important that when survivors do report sexual harassment to law enforcement, that their experiences are not minimized and or only the physical acts of sexual violence are not automatically categorized as more harmful or detrimental to a survivor than non-physical forms of sexual violence. In addition, perpetrators of sexual harassment need to be held legally responsible for their actions. Survivors shouldn't have to go to great lengths to prove that they have been harassed. They should be supported and believed. On behalf of the staff and advocates at Save of Essex County, we are willing and able to be the leaders of the village to help end sexual harassment in New Jersey. Thank you.
Kirsten Brannigan.
Good evening. And first, I'd like to thank the Division on Civil Rights and Ywca and all of those who have been involved in this very important topic and these efforts. I also thank all of the experts here this evening for their time and testimony. And I also commend all of the survivors who have bravely come forward to testify today. My name is Kirsten Brannigan. I'm the proud owner of a law firm in Montclair that's woman-owned. I've practiced law in New Jersey for the past 24 years exclusively in the area of employment law. During that time, I've had a substantial exposure to sexual harassment matters. Given the ample testimony provided on so many different topics, I'm going to focus my comments more on remediation of sexual harassment, specifically with respect to investigations. While relevant New Jersey cases have addressed the need for employers to conduct prompt and thorough investigations, there is no statute, regulation, or formal guidance articulating what is required for an investigation to be effective. A sexual harassment investigation can be a complex process with many moving pieces to manage. Effective investigations can unquestionably help eradicate sexual harassment. Throughout my career, I've conducted numerous independent investigations. In that role, at times, I've been called upon to assess evidence as to the underlying conduct, but also as to the employer's internal investigation. I have seen the impact of ineffective investigations in other neutral roles that I hold, such as mediator, arbitrator, and expert witness, as well as in my representation of those subjected to sexual harassment. In all of these capacities, I've encountered a variety of challenges on investigations that could significantly be reduced through specific statutory and regulatory requirements in New Jersey. I have seen investigations that are biased, conducted as a formality or a sham, or to whitewash the conduct. Employers sometimes commence an investigation only to try to defend against legal claims, but are less concerned about arriving at a fair estimate of the truth and or actually remedying the conduct. Often these purported investigations will not withstand scrutiny, and they also rarely result in recommendations to actually stop the harassment in the workplace, including the removal of the harasser. Investigators need to be impartial, objective, credible, able to manage a complex process, and be knowledgeable both on the underlying subject matter and also on conducting investigations. Internal personnel can often face obstacles such as familiarity with the parties and bias challenges that are inherent when the investigator is employed by the same entity. Sometimes investigations are conducted by an individual with bias, coupled with a lack of knowledge and training on how to conduct an investigation, and the results can be devastatingly deficient. In order for investigations to be effective, employers need to devote sufficient resources to the area. Even a well-trained and capable investigator will face challenges if he or she does not have the appropriate level of authority and resources. When individuals performing investigations are not well-versed or experienced in conducting investigations, a variety of problems, including a flawed assessment of the evidence, is likely to occur. When a flawed assessment of the evidence occurs, it is also likely that the organization will not take any meaningful action to alleviate the harassment. In my experience, one of the most devastating lapses occurs when an investigator fails to properly assess credibility in making findings. Unfortunately, it is sometimes just due to ignorance and a lack of training. Some investigators simply do not know what they do not know. Time and time again, investigators will find that allegations cannot be substantiated because they were not corroborated by a witness. In many sexual harassment matters, there's a he said, she said component where one person's word against another's. When investigators do not find other ways to determine credibility, the investigators are essentially deciding that they do not believe the person making the claim. Although there can be times where claims truly cannot be substantiated, the lack of a witness should not be the deciding factor. Engaging in broad brush determinations that a matter cannot be substantiated simply because it was not witnessed is a significant and common shortcoming in investigations. Another failing is that investigators apply more rigorous standards than appropriate. Harassing conduct does not need to be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. A sexual harassment investigation is not a criminal investigation. Investigators often mistakenly apply a more rigorous standard rather than a preponderance of the evidence standard. Under a preponderance of the evidence standard, the investigator makes a judgment on what is believed to have occurred based on what is more likely true than not. Efforts to remediate sexual harassment complaints in New Jersey would be greatly enhanced by clear statutory and regulatory requirements. Not only should there be a clear statutory requirement that an effective investigation be promptly conducted, but there should also be regulations that detail specific requirements that would increase investigations' efficacy, including, but not limited to, the following. Number one, allocation of sufficient resources and authority to investigators to allow for prompt and thorough responses to complaints. Number two, use of impartial, objective, well-trained investigators who are knowledgeable and competent to conduct investigations. Number three, protocols for conducting interviews and managing the many complex issues that arise during the interview process. Number four, guidance on what triggers an investigation and use of appropriate interim measures during the investigation process. Number five, assurances on prevention of retaliation, maintaining confidentiality, and keeping privacy of complainants to the fullest extent possible. Number six, requirements on assessing credibility and designation of proper credibility factors to be considered. Number seven, guidelines on analyzing evidence, coming to a fair estimate of the truth, making findings, and reaching a conclusion. Number eight, delineation of a preponderance of evidence standard as the proper burden of proof. Number nine, guidelines for documenting investigations, including retention of notes and issuance of written reports. And number 10, protocols for communicating the investigation results and appropriate post-investigation monitoring mechanisms. I would like to also highlight some final brief points. I strongly believe, like many others who have testified, that interactive live training is the key to preventing sexual harassment and all types of protected harassment. While there has been a heavy focus on sexual harassment in the past 2 years, given all of the NJLAD protected categories are just as pernicious, they too should be given the proper attention with respect to any preventative and remediation efforts. Thank you for your time.
Namrata Pradhan from Adhikar.
evening, and thank you, the New Jersey Division of Civil Rights. My name is Namrata Pradhan, and I'm a domestic worker organizer. I'm myself at Adhikar, and have been working as a domestic worker for 15 plus years. Adhikar is the only woman-led community-based organization that works for workers' rights, immigration rights, healthcare, justice, and language justice for Nepali-speaking community. We are one of the newest one of the newest immigrant communities in New Jersey, and the majority of our members are low-wage workers. And thank you for hosting this hearing today. In 2017, Adhikar began directed outreach and organizing in New Jersey, as many of our members in New York work in New Jersey or have moved in New Jersey from New York. We have worked with many workers before 2017 who for decades have asked us to organize in New Jersey. In 2 years, we have talked to 100 members of workers and have 60 number of members from New Jersey who are domestic workers. We have conducted over a dozen meetings with domestic workers, hosted leadership development and workforce development trainings, including CPR and nanny trainings. A part of our work in New Jersey is helping ensure that our communities feel safe on various levels, whether it be around the immigration status, reporting wage theft or other labor concerns, or talking about, and if they are ready, reporting sexual harassment charges. In our conversation with domestic workers, sexual harassment experience always come up, but workers are too scared to share their stories due to fear of retaliation from the employers and shame in the community. The stories I'm here is from the worker in New Jersey. So we are imagining if an employer in his boxers in the bathroom, half naked, and asks you to come to the bathroom to help him take off his chain, the chain in his neck, or asks you to pass a towel while he is naked in the bathroom. This was an experience one of our members in Morristown was working as taking care of elder care, who was an Alzheimer's patient. In between working long hours and low pay, domestic workers face harassment like this at their workplace on a regular basis. A lot of our workers work live-in jobs, which means they work in their employer's home. In live-in situation, a lot of time workers are sleeping in the child's room or in the living room or in the elder care patient's room. In these situations, workers have no privacy. Employers have access to workers' sleeping space 24 hours, 7 days. Another experience our worker shared was about her intoxicated employer who came in the middle of the night and laid on the bed she was sleeping in. When she shouted, the employer said he was sorry and thought that he was in his room. This worker decided not to file a complaint because she was undocumented and was afraid of retaliation. Other types of sexual harassment our workers have faced are requests for massages, head and leg, commenting on their appearance, inappropriate hugging, etc. A lot of times, if something happens at our workplace, even if workers say something, the other members of the family don't trust us because the employers have the power. Workers feel insecure because if they say something, they will lose their jobs. And even if they do something, they have to go through a long process to get justice from the system. Domestic workers are not the only ones that face these types of harassment. We know that nail salon workers and restaurant workers face sexual harassment on the job. Our organizing in New Jersey is directed as domestic workers, but we would urge you to look into various industries where harassment and other claims may be less regulated. Adhikar is not making any specific policy recommendation for this hearing today, but we would ask that you consider the following within your recommendation. Strongest protection for less regulated industries with fewer employees, such as domestic work, nail salon workers, and restaurant workers. Sexual harassment in these industries are often overlooked, and although everyone is guaranteed a safe work environment, we need to take into consideration what this means for people who work in homes, smaller businesses, and off the books. State responsibility in educating employers and employees on the sexual harassment laws, especially in the less regulated industries. The responsibility is often put on organizations like ours to educate employees on their rights and even employers. This responsibility to educate or at least resource the education should be on the state. It is not enough to create policy if people do not know the policies. Strong and timely enforcement system to support workers in reporting sexual harassment cases. We often find when workers report claims of any type that state accountability system put the burden of proof on the employee beyond what an employee has documented, and that process take a time so deter people from reporting or completing a case. People's immigration status should not be deter reporting claims. Many times in our community, people's immigration status or worker under the table will prevent them from reporting cases. We urge you to think through a system that will encourage people to report their issues no matter the immigration status or if they work on the books. We also want to recommend that domestic workers need to be included in the human rights law of New Jersey and increase the statute of limitation to match at least New York at 3 years. Support the Domestic Worker Bill of Rights in New Jersey to address the systematic issues of domestic workers' exploitation. Include domestic worker in the minimum wage increase because an underpaid worker is a vulnerable worker. Increase funding for outreach, co-enforcement, and worker center support. Thank you.
Thank you. Next is Nancy Erica Smith from Smith Mullen.
Good evening. Thank you. I've been a civil rights lawyer doing sexual harassment cases for 39 years. When I became a lawyer, I thought that we were on the cusp of changing the world. We have not changed the world. Sexual harassment is as pervasive today as it was 39 years ago. I have some ideas about why. There's a new book out. It's called Unequal: How American Courts Have Undermined Discrimination Laws. That's one way that we have one of the best laws in the country. In fact, our law was passed thanks to the New Jersey Division on Civil Rights was created in 1945 unanimously by our legislature and signed that day. And I know you're going to have a celebration of that. And it's something that I'm very proud of in New Jersey. And we have one of the best laws in the country in New Jersey. But we have looked to federal law a lot when we're interpreting that law, although lawyers that fight this fight against that. And the judge-made laws are universally pro-employer and anti-women. Those kinds of laws include when the United States Supreme Court agreed that sexual harassment is sex discrimination, which many federal courts had said it wasn't, they said the harassment had to be severe or pervasive to be actionable. So a little harassment is okay. And for the past 39 years that I've been a lawyer, it's usually been a male judge deciding how little amount of sexual harassment is okay. I've disagree with most of that, and if you read Unequal, the book, you'll read incredible stories of what judges have said doesn't rise to the level of being actual sexual harassment. New York just passed a law saying severe and pervasive is not the standard anymore. Number one, New Jersey should do that. Number two, then they made up this law that what used to be called direct evidence, the best evidence you can have, like I don't want to work with women, that used to be you win. And then the courts created this law, oh no, that's a stray comment and the jury can't even hear it. So what used to be direct evidence of discrimination is now called a stray comment, and the jury doesn't get to hear the horrible things you said about women. That is another thing we have to fix. Ms. Brannigan talked about investigations. A judge-made law in New Jersey, our Supreme Court decided that in a case called Aguas, with a wonderful dissent from Justice Barry Albin, that the employer has to have the right to investigate before you can sue. Now, what does that mean in the real world? In the real world, that means you have to go to HR without a lawyer, and tell them your story, and how they react to you has a lot to do with how you tell that story. How safe you feel, how you get sucked in. If somebody is really nice, my clients get sucked into saying, well, maybe it's not, maybe he is mean to everybody, maybe it isn't my gender. These are the kinds of things that happen every day in HR. Making the employee go to the employer first is bad law. The dissent is right. That should be changed. Let's talk about confidentiality. My clients do not usually want confidentiality. That doesn't mean they're going to hold press conferences. That does mean they may want to talk to their coworkers about what happened to them. They may have seen other coworkers also harassed. Confidentiality is used to hurt women, not help them. It is used to prevent you from bringing other witnesses forward, from seeking support in the workplace, and from just being able to tell people. I have a case against New Jersey Transit, an incredible case of harassment, hostile work environment, retaliation. They found no wrongdoing by New Jersey Transit, but my client was disciplined for violating confidentiality because she wrote an email to the EEO officer and copied her boss about a recent retaliation. Confidentiality is a smokescreen for shutting us up. That brings me to NDAs, which I work with Patricia on, Teffenhart, and I'm really proud of this law. Anything that I did to push it, it's Senator Loretta Weinberg's law. NDAs is when a woman who's raped or sexually assaulted or harassed is told, in order to settle, if you want to settle your case and move on with your life and maybe get another career going, you have to shut up about it. If you mention it at a cocktail party, if you tell your next employer, if you tell your next door neighbor, if you tell your minister, you can be sued by the guy who harassed you. In New Jersey, they're no longer enforceable. It's a wonderful law. It's a great law. I'm really proud that we've done that. The next thing that tells women to shut up, of course, is mandatory arbitration. The House of Representatives passed the Fairness in Arbitration Act yesterday. Anything we can do to get the Senate to pass that bill, although Trump will probably not sign it because he's got NDAs with all the women he harassed and raped. But mandatory arbitration should be on everybody's, really at the top of your list of how do we stop harassment? We stop mandatory arbitration. Secret corporate courts where women are told every day to shut up, and you can't talk about what happened to you. And the public doesn't know. When I sue somebody in court, the public knows that I'm saying this company, this agency did something wrong. When we do it in secret arbitration, nobody knows about it, including the other women harassed by that same harasser. Arbitration, secret corporate courts have to go. Finally, California recently came out with a study that showed that they have a more robust economy and healthier businesses because they ban non-competes. Non-competition agreements keep women in abusive work environments, and it's not good business. And they enforce them even on workers in McDonald's and places where clearly you're not learning the secret Coke formula. There's absolutely no reason for it. If we ban non-competes, women will have a lot more power in the workplace to change jobs when they're with that harassing boss. Those are my ideas. Thank you.
Thank you. Jean LoCicero, Legal Director of the ACLU of New Jersey.
Good evening, and thank you for the opportunity to testify at this hearing. My name is Jean LoCicero, and I am the Legal Director at the ACLU of New Jersey. And we're really grateful that the Division on Civil Rights and the New Jersey Coalition Against Sexual Assault, in collaboration with Rutgers, are holding these hearings to hear from directly impacted New Jerseyans and people who advocate for them. Harassment and discrimination in all its forms, whether based on sex, race, or any other protected trait, alone or in concert, undermine people's safety, dignity, and equality, And our hope is that the current scrutiny that you're giving sexual harassment can inform a broad-based response that improves the lives of all New Jerseyans. There have been a lot of comments that I prepared that are in your binders, I hope, so I'll try not to repeat too much. But I did want to point out that people have talked about retaliation, and in one Eeoc released landmark report, the fears of retaliation are well-founded because 3/4 of employees who have lodged complaints say that they experience some form of blowback, whether that be from firing or demotion or being socially ostracized. And then I did want to point out that sexual harassment frequently occurs in concert with other forms of abuse, so that harassment directed at women of color, for instance, can draw on ugly historic stereotypes about their sexual availability, or workers with disabilities and LGBTQI workers face similarly distinct harassment by virtue of their intersecting identities. And then low-wage workers like the domestic workers we've heard from, retail employees, hospitality industry workers, and agricultural laborers, who are often disproportionately women of color, are especially vulnerable to abuse due to the gross power disparities posed by language barriers, immigration status, and lack of resource in every sense. And so I'd like to talk about some of our recommendations to strengthen anti-discrimination protections, echoing commitments to enforcement where New Jerseyans need state agencies to enforce the law in letter and spirit, and we recommend that the legislative and executive branches provide appropriate funding and resources for DCR and other agencies to robustly enforce these laws and regulations so that our residents can be protected. Also echoing the calls for expanded statutes of limitations. The current 180 days for administrative complaints is just too short, and people seeking redress of their civil rights face many barriers acting within six months, including not knowing their rights, fearing retaliation, and then shouldering their work and family responsibilities. And then we recommend the 3 years as well, and especially in the context of filing a legal complaint, that can be time consuming, especially for low-wage workers whose damages may be less substantial. And so just even having access to the legal community can be time consuming. We also think this should protect all workers. The law should be absolutely clear that employers are liable for harassment when experienced by any worker, regardless of their status on the payroll. So we're talking about interns, we're talking about vendors, contractors, anyone in the workplace should be protected. Also echo the calls for employer-imposed secrecy. ACLU supports a ban on the use of forced arbitration and on NDAs and employment contracts. And then to add, to foster deterrence and accountability, we also recommend that parties who settle LAD complaints or arbitrate them be required to report those to DCR. We also echo the calls for meaningful training and ask that DCR consider its role in offering, identifying, and sharing best practices and standards regarding those trainings. And then we'd like you to consider starting young with youth, which is to say that the state's student learning standards regarding bias and bullying prevention and comprehensive sexual health education developed by the Department of Education are an important resource here. And it's vital that students are taught age-appropriate and medically accurate lessons and skills designed to equip them to have healthy, positive, and safe relationships. And in particularly, when effectively implemented, New Jersey's comprehensive sexual health curriculum requirements can help reduce gender and LGBTQI bias and stereotyping and build the foundation for positive and healthy attitudes towards sexuality and interpersonal relationships. And so we hope you can find a way to hold school districts accountable when they're not meeting those standards. And then I'd like to spend a minute talking about prisons and jails as places of public accommodation. At the ACLU of New Jersey, we have found that people who are incarcerated are especially vulnerable to sexual discrimination, harassment, and assault. And we know about the shameful crisis at the state's women's prison that was revealed last year, which resulted in the arrests of at least 7 corrections officers who were criminally accused of sexually abusing incarcerated women. And while that may be being addressed, for every arrest made, there are countless other experiences of harassment and assault in New Jersey's jails and prisons, and many of them are unreported. And unsurprisingly, members of the LGBTQI community in prison are especially at risk. And I know from experiences of myself and colleagues who meet and correspond with people who are incarcerated, many of whom are men, that because they have so little control over their lives and safety, it takes a lot of courage to report sexual misconduct. My colleagues and I have heard stories of victims of harassment and misconduct who, once they decide to report, are prevented from doing so by officers or staff. And then after a report is filed, we've heard about inappropriate investigations that seem designed to come to a conclusion that the misconduct did not even occur. We've heard of environments so hostile that corrections officers have threatened to out LGBT prisoners. And I can tell you that my understanding is that sexual harassment on its own, which is independent of abuse, is so common that many members of the prison and jail community are immune to even viewing it as a problem to be addressed. And I'll just tell you a parallel story, which is that we currently represent someone who filed a grievance about racist harassment and treatment by an officer. And when prison investigators couldn't sustain his complaint, they charged him with perpetrating a fraud. And then he ended up subjected to significant discipline, including administrative segregation. This creates a culture where prisoners justifiably fear retaliation by corrections officers for raising concerns about bias-based harassment. And so we ask DCR to recognize its enforcement powers under the LAD to extend to prisons and jails as places of public accommodation. And we also recommend that DCR collect information from prisons and jails about reports of discrimination, harassment, and retaliation so that we can identify opportunities to encourage reporting, reform investigations, and implement best practices to improve the welfare and dignity of people who are incarcerated. And so with that, I'd like to thank you and tell you that the ACLU of New Jersey is ready to work with you and other community stakeholders to achieve meaningful reforms. Thank you.
Thank you, Jean. Next is Helen Arcantu from the YWCA.
Good evening. I'm Helen Arcantu, CEO of the YWCA of Northern New Jersey, which operates Healing Space, Bergen County's only sexual violence resource center. Healing Space supports survivors with vital services and educates professionals and the community to prevent sexual violence. I'd like to thank the New Jersey Office of the Attorney General, Division of Civil Rights, and the New Jersey Coalition Against Sexual Assault for hosting these public hearings. Forums like these are essential to give survivors the platform to be heard, gather expert input, and work together to end sexual harassment in New Jersey. I've spent the last 25 years of my career working with survivors of sexual violence, so this is an issue that I'm very familiar with and is of the utmost importance to me. In January of 2018, the YWCA of Northern New Jersey and New Jersey Assemblywoman Valerie Venneri Huddle together established the Time Is Now Action Coalition in response to the wave of people who were stepping out of the shadows to say #MeToo and breaking the silence on sexual harassment, discrimination, and all forms of sexual violence. Although it was encouraging that so many celebrities stepped forward to share their stories so survivors did not feel alone, we were concerned that the average person would still fear that their story would not be embraced because they did not have celebrity status. We organized over 50 diverse government, business, labor, education, legal, faith-based, and nonprofit leaders and organizations to stand together and give the message to Bergen County residents that they were not alone and that we wanted to see change. To that end, we started a similar means to this series of public hearings to hear stories from survivors as well as get input from expert panelists. In February 2018, we hosted 4 town halls with over 100 attendees and a 24/7 virtual town hall to gather ideas and experiences from the community to inform an action plan. Our attendees bravely shared their stories. We kept transcripts of this and later reviewed them to see themes that would evolve into our Time Is Now Action Coalition's key areas of focus. We hosted a community update of these themes in April of 2018 with the New Jersey First Lady Tammy Snyder Murphy, and then convened 4 working groups to roll up our collective sleeves towards our coalition goals. We heard from survivors and the community in our town halls, and that became the bedrock of our efforts. As the findings from these hearings will inform the action needed to end sexual harassment in New Jersey, I'd like to share some of the key takeaways from our town halls that rolled up into our focus, as well as some of the quotes and paraphrase related to the sexual harassment that's of focus to this hearing. One key area was education about what is and isn't okay starts at home at an early age, and the conversation must continue. Men play a critical role in these discussions. Some of the supporting comments that were made at our hearings were, girls and women especially struggle with putting their own needs first. We must raise our girls strong. We must let girls know it's okay to speak up and say what you need to say. Another was talking openly with your children and empowering them to speak up and even to give bosses in the workplace knowledge that what they're doing is not okay is key. We are proponents of, at a young age, teaching children about healthy sexual development. And I know that that's very taboo to a lot of parents because they are thinking that you're teaching them about how to have sex. But the reality is you're teaching them what is right and what is wrong. Beyond the relationship between coaches and students, as a father and son, as an uncle, I am sure all of us men here have young men in our worlds, and we would have a tremendous influence, much more than we realize, if we simply bother not only to talk, but to really show them by example over time. Behave well in front of our young men. Another theme was some workplace and industries have chronic culture of sexual harassment. We heard from a number of restaurant workers, bakery workers, and individuals that worked in bars. One restaurant worker shared, over the years I've been harassed many times by customers, coworkers, managers, and even owners. I've been touched, slapped, and groped inappropriately on more than one occasion when there was little to no consequence for the employer, even owner. I even once had a female bar manager pull me aside and state that I needed to perform sexual favors on customers to increase our happy hour capacity. It's extremely hard to prepare yourself for the actions you might take if you're ever sexually harassed in the workplace. Another restaurant worker shared, I was lucky enough that I had a bar in front of me, so there was no groping or inappropriate touching. But there were many times when I would open the gates of the restaurant outside and gentlemen approached me, like 2 inches away from me, looked me up and down and said very vulgar comments that I cannot repeat to you here today. So I just swallowed my pride and kept opening up the gates. Another male client came to me and said, how much are they paying you here? I can pay you more if you come with me. I've been told that I have to just keep it to myself. Knowing that I can't do anything about these comments is even more frustrating. A third theme was corporations can no longer turn a blind eye to workplace harassment, but it often feels unsafe to support at your company. Some corporate women of older generations viewed their harassment as a necessary evil that was just part of the arena and culture in a male-dominated workplace. Now we have a lens and women are revisiting their experiences. It's not just about touch, but words too. When you work for someone and they're offering you something to get something, you're being propositioned, and that's harassment. Maybe the older generation has an excuse for workplace culture of their time, but in today's workplace, there's no longer an excuse for that unacceptable behavior. When you're a young woman in a workplace environment, the link here is that something happened, you felt uncomfortable, and you did not really know what to do about it. Sometimes, because of the way it happened, you're not exactly sure what happened. But the more you sit with it, you're like, wait a second, that wasn't right. My big boss called me into his office and said to me, you have to go out with so-and-so for dinner because he wants you to go out with him, and you bring me back that contract. At that point, because I had options, I said, go ask your daughter to do it, and then I packed up my stuff and left. When you're a young woman in a corporate environment, things happen and you're not sure what to do about it. Sometimes reporting is risky, including to your bosses or to your HR department. Their priority is protecting the company. Policy just isn't enough. Also, to recognize the diversity of survivors, anyone can be affected by sexual violence, and that we must believe survivors. Historically, and these are quotes from our town halls, historically African American women from the days of slavery have been seen as property, and we know that sexual harassment is not about sex. It's about power, it's about dominance, it's about control. And for the most part, African American women do not have the power and control, especially in the workplace, so their stories get ignored and they do not speak up. As an individual with a disability, I would like to add that persons with disabilities are more prone to violence than others, one woman shared. We have to speak up every single time, not just when it directly concerns people like us. We had conversations about Weinstein, and at some point, this woman who I considered more evolved actually said to me, it was Gwyneth Paltrow, why didn't she speak up? What was her problem? I tried my best to get her to understand that this man was very powerful and had control over her entire career, and that she and anybody who is coming forward now deserved support and our thanks and did not deserve to be thought of as why they didn't come forward sooner. So the key takeaways for our town halls was that we rolled up into 4 working groups of 4 areas. One was education through pre-K through college, and this group is focusing on we need to raise young people through all stages of development with age-appropriate education and healthy sexuality, beginning among us in our families with our smallest children and continuing through primary and secondary school years. We are not going to stop sexual violence if we don't address it all the way to college campuses. Industry practices. As high-profile cases of workplace harassment and sexual assault are exposed and addressed, we must also bring poor treatment of workers across industries at middle and lower level into the light and ensure that their rights to safe workplaces are fulfilled. We have another group called Beyond Corporate HR. Workplace harassment deeply impacts both individuals and organizations. Settlement of workplace harassment claims may cost companies money, but hidden costs include diminished employee morale, engagement, and productivity. Employees and employers must be clear on appropriate and inappropriate workplace behavior. For example, there's no concept of consensual between bosses and workers. Companies must create genuinely safe environments. I just want to say, too, we had multiple people come and speak, and I was very brave because they worked for very large corporations in Bergen County, and they shared over and over again, we go to the training, we have the manuals, we know who the person to go report to is, but the company is not going to look out for me, and I can't go to them, I'm not safe, and I cannot, the process is broken. So it's not as if they didn't have the training and they didn't know, they just didn't feel safe embracing it. And last but not least, supporting survivors. Survivors are people of all genders, races, ethnicities, income levels, religion, sexual orientation, and disabilities. It can be extremely difficult for a survivor to come forward and share their story. There's no timetable for disclosing or recovering from sexual violence. It is essential that all survivors are believed, supported, and have open access to health care, legal counseling, and all necessary services. So in closing, I just want to say we know from our work at Ywca Northern New Jersey's Healing Space that it's extremely difficult for survivors to come forward and to share their stories. We know they feel ashamed, concerned that they won't be believed, and worried about being blamed. We've heard so many stories here today, obviously, that support that, and so many great recommendations. I would just like to end by saying if you were a survivor and you shared your story today, thank you for sharing your story and your bravery to do that. There's lots of actions that I know that you've been given to take. This is how we're attacking it here in Bergen County in terms of having these work groups work on these areas, and we are here to work with you in any way that we can to support your efforts. Thank you.
Kelly Horan Florio, Assistant U.S. Attorney, Civil Division, U.S. Attorney's Office.
Good evening. I'd like to start by thanking our hosts for this evening for inviting us to this important event, the New Jersey Division on Civil Rights and New Jersey Coalition Against Sexual Assault. Sexual harassment is a widespread problem that without question deserves attention, and it has the attention of the U.S. Attorney's Office. I'm Kelly Horan Florio. I'm an Assistant U.S. Attorney here in New Jersey in the Civil Division Civil Rights Unit. And I'm here tonight on behalf of the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of New Jersey and Craig Carpenito, our U.S. Attorney. Many people think of the U.S. Attorney's Office only as criminal prosecutors. And it is true that one of our core missions is investigating and prosecuting people for violations of federal criminal law. It's one way that we keep New Jersey residents safe. But what many people don't know is that we do more than just bring criminal prosecutions. We have a dedicated civil rights unit in our civil division that works exclusively on civil rights enforcement, which includes combating sexual harassment. Much of the media attention on sexual harassment has focused on celebrities and public figures. What hasn't gotten nearly as much attention is sexual harassment that occurs to everyday people in everyday settings, both in housing and in employment. Much of what you're hearing about tonight is about sexual harassment in the workplace, which is a significant issue
a very well-known problem and something our office has a strong interest in combating, together with our partners at Eeoc, the New Jersey Division on Civil Rights, and various advocacy groups. We also want to talk tonight about another problem that's equally significant, but oftentimes not spoken about as much: sexual harassment in housing. Sexual harassment in housing can take the form of a landlord or maintenance worker or someone else in power related to housing abusing that power over tenants or applicants. It can affect anyone, but it particularly affects low-income or marginalized persons. Persons who can then be faced with feeling like they must choose between putting up with sexual harassment and complying with sexual demands or losing their homes. They may believe that they have nowhere to turn, and many feel like they have no choice but to tolerate it if they want to stay in their home. And often, victims won't report it because they don't have any place else to go if they lose their home. We believe, as I'm sure that you do, that everyone has the right to feel safe in their home. But even more importantly, sexual harassment in housing is illegal. It violates the Federal Fair Housing Act. Under the FHA, all have the right to be free from unwanted sexual conduct and harassment, as well as the right to be free from retaliation for reporting sexual harassment. Through our enforcement of the Fair Housing Act, we can, have, and will open investigations or file lawsuits to combat sexual harassment. We can and will take action against those who abuse their position to prey on vulnerable victims. Our time is limited tonight, so I don't want to focus just on past enforcement actions, but rather I want to talk to you about proactive steps that our office has taken and what others can do to combat sexual harassment in housing. In the face of this too often silent epidemic, the Justice Department has launched a nationwide initiative to combat sexual harassment in housing. The U.S. Attorney's Office has taken a lead role to push forward the goals of this initiative here in New Jersey. What are those goals? Well, one is enforcement. The Department of Justice has increased enforcement efforts in this area. During the first year of the initiative, DOJ opened more new matters than any previous year in the department's history, and more than 5 times the number opened in the year immediately prior to the launch. Another is education and outreach. We want to make sure that people know that sexual harassment in housing can violate the Fair Housing Act and that the U.S. Attorney's Office can take action, both relating to the harassment itself and to any retaliations that victims may face from reporting it. We also want to get the word out that our federal and state partners can take action, including HUD and the New Jersey Division on Civil Rights. Because people may know that it is wrong when their landlord, property manager, or someone else sexually harasses them, but they may not know that this conduct is illegal or that the U.S. Attorney's Office and our federal and state partners may be able to help, even in cases where victims acquiesce to the demands of their harasser. So we're here to spread the word. How have we done that so far? We've had meetings with advocacy groups and our federal and state partners to discuss what the U.S. Attorney's Office can do and how we can best work together to combat this problem. We've also created several public documents to both educate the public and urge victims to report, including information sheets, flyers, palm cards, complaint hotlines, a website, and public service announcement video and audio components. We urge all who may encounter sexual harassment victims to post and distribute these materials, and where it makes sense, to create their own materials, informing people about their rights and where to seek help. We believe that through these efforts, we all can be more effective in bringing government resources to bear on landlords and others who violate the rights of some of our most vulnerable residents. We thank the New Jersey Division on Civil Rights and the New Jersey Coalition Against Sexual Assault for the invitation to speak tonight, and we commend you for your efforts in this very important endeavor. Thank you.
I want to call on Penny Benetis, a professor at Rutgers Law School and the director of the clinic that we are working with on the report.
Hello, thank you. My name is Penny Vedetis. I'm a faculty member at Rutgers Law School at the Newark campus, and I've been teaching there for almost 30 years. I am the Dickinson R. Debevoise Scholar at the law school and the director of the International Human Rights Clinic. I've been teaching students to use the law as a tool for positive social change for nearly 3 decades. And I'm so proud to see that 2 of my students, former students, testified here, Kirsten Brannigan and Jean Cicero. And I'm also very proud that Nancy Erica Smith is a graduate of our clinic, although she predated me. In the clinic, we amplify the voices of those, like many of the people who spoke here tonight, by representing them in civil rights and human rights litigation and other forms of advocacy. By way of background, I also served as the executive vice president and legal director for 3 years while I was on academic leave, working at Legal Momentum, the Women's Legal Defense and Education Fund, which is the oldest women's rights legal advocacy group in the country. I'm very proud that our clinic is co-sponsoring this event, and I salute all who have testified, whether they testified as experts or survivors of sexual harassment, assault, and abuse. So I'm testifying here in 2 capacities, one as an expert and one as a victim of sexual harassment. Like many who have spoken here tonight, and during other public hearings on sexual harassment, I have been sexually harassed. Many times, actually. My first experience being sexually harassed was when I was in elementary school. One of my teachers figured out very quickly that my immigrant parents, who were extremely focused on education, would reprimand me if I got a poor grade. This teacher would send me on meaningless errands whenever we had a test. When I would return back to the classroom, the test would be over. He would then tell me to meet him in the classroom during recess or lunch so that I could take the test alone with him in private. I dutifully would report to the appointed room to take the test when no one was around. Without reading it, he would put a big 0 on top of the test paper and tell me that my parents would be very upset if I brought home a failing grade. He then promised to convert the grade to a 100 if I sat on his lap and kissed him. I would always refuse. I kicked him several times. He would then, of course, grade the test accurately, but he always tried again. This went on for quite some time. He did give me 0s in conduct semester after semester. I think he figured that if he actually put a 0 on my paper, people would realize that something fishy was going on. Anyway, needless to say, the 0s in conduct on a repeated basis were a source of great conflict between my parents and me. I would say 7 and 8 when I had this teacher. But that was not the only time that I was sexually harassed. When I was a paralegal at the Manhattan District Attorney's Office, an attorney who I had been working for as a paralegal for about a year started asking me on dates literally the moment that I asked him for a recommendation for law school and told him that his alma mater was my first choice of law schools. I refused to go out on a date with him. And he, in the end, after stringing me along for months about writing a recommendation, refused to write a recommendation for me, even though he had given me stellar performance ratings during my reviews. In the end, I never completed my application to my first choice law school. In law school, I was sexually harassed by a fellow student who was in a position of authority over me. I reported him immediately and wanted to file a complaint against him. It turns out that neither the law school nor the university had a sexual harassment policy. As a response to my complaint, the university put together a working group of faculty and students and adopted the sexual harassment policy that our committee recommended, which was terrific. But the student who harassed me was never disciplined because there was no policy in place when I reported the abuse, and the university enacted the policy after the student had graduated. As a junior associate at a prominent international law firm, I was harassed by an employee of one of our corporate clients. I was sent in to, it was an antitrust case that went on for months, and I was sent in to make sure that the merger that my firm was working on, that it went through. And it was a big task. It was very exciting. Anyway, this employee had information that I needed to submit to the Department of Justice in order for the merger to go through. He invited me to his office to give me the information. When I got there, he shoved me into a corner and tried to sexually assault me. I reported him. I was fortunate because my law firm was very responsive. The firm reported him to his employers, our client corporation, and I never had to come into contact with him again. I'm not the only one in my family to have been sexually harassed. A young relative at age 14 was doing community service at a local library by tutoring students in math and science. The library assigned a boy of 11 to her. That boy, who she met twice a week for several weeks, tried to kiss her every time he came into contact with her, and we're talking about an 11-year-old here, and berated her by calling her ugly and weird when she refused to let him kiss her. Each session, he would pull out what he called quote-unquote science books out of his backpack and show her pictures of penises and vaginas. The girl was terrified. She didn't know what to do. This was her first work experience. She was frozen. She blamed herself. She tried to brush it off, but it still impacted her mental health. Anyway, my stories and my family's stories are not unique, as we have heard during these hearings. You've heard versions of these stories from everyone who has testified here and the other day in Atlantic City. Sadly, I don't know a single woman who has not been sexually harassed, either by a fellow student, a teacher, a coworker, a boss, or a total stranger who catcalls or grabs her private parts on the subway or while she's walking down the street minding her own business. Sexual harassment transcends all races, ethnicities, and socioeconomic classes. Sexual harassment exists in all professions, including in academia and in the legal profession. What is so striking about sexual harassment as opposed to other forms of discrimination is that it is still so overt. Think about that. Title IX and comparable state statutes were enacted over 50 years ago. Yet, as we have heard from many people who testified, quid pro quo sexual abuse is still extremely common. This type of abuse is situations where a coworker, a boss, threatens to fire someone or to make them lose their job unless she has sex with them or dates them. Hostile work environment harassment is also blatant and overt even in 2019. This type of harassment exists in situations where employers use name-calling, ask workers about their sex life, comment on someone's outfits, and display sexual imagery to make it impossible for someone to complete their job. Sexual harassment is blatant and ubiquitous. We must eradicate it. How do we do this, though? Many people have proposed very good solutions here, very, very concrete examples of what needs to be done, whether it's legislative reform, whether it's changing the culture of the workplace. And I support all of those recommendations. I want to focus, however, on solutions that some people have alluded to, but I'd like to place greater emphasis on. That is, we have to see the link between Title VII and Title IX, which are the two sides of the same coins. We must start as early as possible to teach children to develop healthy relationships. I know others have said this already, but I want to emphasize it. The training must start in pre-K and run through 12th grade with age-appropriate education that includes simulations, stories, songs, and other methods to teach children to respect each other. Training must continue in college and through graduate school. College students, many who are away from parental supervision for the first time, must know what a healthy relationship is. They must know how to date properly and how to have a proper intimate relationship that does not involve abuse. If a student abuses a fellow student, that student is likely to be an abusive worker. Today's college students are tomorrow's managers, and we really have to remember that. We need a broad public education program about what constitutes harassment. It is critical to have Know Your Rights presentations in the workplace, public spaces like schools, YWCA, YMCA venues, church basements, youth centers, and other places where people actually congregate and feel safe. Go to community centers and present educational sessions in different languages. It is critical to reinforce education about healthy relationships for children in after-school programs, religious settings, and recreational settings. Make clear at all the educational settings that everybody knows how to report harassment, whether it happens in the school setting or in the workplace. Representatives from the state and the federal government should attend these sessions, and they should be in different languages so that people can understand them. It's important for the state and the federal government to be present so that they can recognize trends and areas where investigation needs, there needs to be more investigation, and they could use their investigative powers to investigate harassment in particular fields. Enforcement is really critical. The enforcement must be proactive. There are already very strong laws in place in New Jersey. We just need to enforce them better. The state should set up hotlines for sexual harassment and sexual abuse. Those hotlines should be well-staffed. They should not consist of just answering machines or voicemail. Hotline workers must be well-trained, and they must be multilingual. The state should follow up on any complaints and begin investigations within a short period of time. That is the only way to build public trust. Investigation must be thorough and completed quickly, and complaints should just not sit there. The other thing is to hold harassers accountable. It really, fines hurt, and many employers, unfortunately, will not change their action unless they are fined, unless they are defendants in a lawsuit, and unless they are actually forced to change their policies. We also have to enact some new laws. There have been excellent proposals that have been made by those who have testified before me. The ones I want to emphasize are how critical it is to make all workplaces subject to sexual harassment laws, regardless of how many employees they have and where the employment takes place. We also need standardized requirements for reporting for any investigations that are conducted, and we also support OSHA-style designation for sexual harassment, even if it doesn't include physical violence. So I'm very delighted that we can be a part of this process, and thank you for allowing me to testify.
Reba Watson, Newark EEOC Enforcement Supervisor.
Good evening. I would like to thank New Jersey Division on Civil Rights and New Jersey Coalition Against Sexual Assault for hosting such imperative public hearings. My name is Reba Watson. I am the Enforcement Supervisor from the U.S. EEOC Newark Area Office. I'm pleased to have the opportunity to testify to you about the urgent need for employers to address the issue of sexual harassment in the workplace. Beginning in October 2018, high-profile revelations of sexual harassment and the rise of the hashtag #MeToo and similar movements fueled a cultural awakening throughout our nation. The EEOC is the charged federal agency to investigate and litigate complaints of harassment of all kinds for all types of workers and in all kinds of workplaces. As the nation awakens to a persistent problem of workplace harassment, the EEOC's mission became more urgent. We have intensified our efforts to develop and share solutions for scourge workplace harassment. EEOC issued the first guidelines on sexual harassment in 1980. In 1986, the Supreme Court declared that workplace harassment violates Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. In the years since, the EEOC has received charges of sexual harassment across all industries and job categories, from agricultural fields to retail establishments to boardrooms, but the most important issue for us to address at this stage is that most sexual harassment is unreported. Extensive surveys conducted by researchers report shocking statistics. 25% of female employees surveyed say they have been sexually harassed, and as many as 60% report experienced sexual crude conduct. And yet 70% do not even complain internally about their experiences. We know well that even these shocking figures do not represent the full extent of these violations and do not include sexual harassment reported by males. These events go unreported and unpunished. Why? When asked, victims cited humiliation, career damage, shame, disbelief, and fear of further physical or emotional abuse. But the greatest factor is the fear factor of retaliation. In our experience investigating sexual harassment charges, the fear of retaliation is very well founded. The EEOC's focused effort initiated a launch of the Select Task Force on the study of harassment in the workplace to identify the depth of the problem. The EEOC released data in its fiscal year 2018 report highlighting its ramped-up efforts to combat and prevent workplace harassment. Our agency reported a 13.6% increase in sexual harassment charges and 50% increase in lawsuits filed alleging sexual harassment. Hits on the EEOC sexual harassment webpage have doubled since the start of the hashtag #MeToo movement 1 year ago. We know without a doubt that this unlawful and destructive behavior occurs in every kind of workplace, large, small, throughout the country. What can we do about it? Advocacy groups reach out to their constituents with information, support, and representation. Law enforcement agencies solicit and accept invitations to speak out at occasions like this one. Lawyer groups and bar associations offer programs and encourage their members to volunteer, and attorneys have responded in huge numbers, offering their expertise pursuing claims and litigation. What is most important? Employers. Employers themselves must recognize the harm occurring in their workplaces. It is imperative that they become proactive rather than reactive. Control starts at the top. Leaders must hold themselves and their management responsible and accountable. When they neglect these offenses as they occur in their workplaces, every aspect of their business, from budgets to employee morale to productivity and their reputation, is affected. It is critical for everyone to understand that sexual harassment is a serial behavior. We read the screaming headlines about high-profile harassers whose behavior is nothing short of criminal. More and more victims come forward. It is likely to be the same in less famous and visible workplaces. There is likely to be more than one victim, which will alert management to look beyond that one incident when it comes to its attention. Policies must be implemented, clearly articulated and enforced, regardless of the industry type and size. Employers must create a culture in which employees trust that their complaints will be heard and acted on. Correction must start at the top. Leadership must hold all offenders accountable. To start, employees, regardless of business and size, must develop written policies that specify what behaviors are unacceptable. Declaring zero tolerance is really not a policy. Zero tolerance of what? There is an entire range of verbal and physical behaviors that can be called sexual harassment. Will they all result in being fired? That is just not good management. Good management involves prevention, training, clear communication with staff policy implementation, and much more. Practices must create a foundation where employees are empowered to formally complain. Those same policies and practices should support employees who witness such harassment, that they are empowered to report such acts. Employees must understand that the absence of complaints do not mean that there are no offenses. It means that employees are fearful of reporting them. Improper behavior only gets worse. It does not go away by itself. There are some of the points that the EEOC makes in its outreach and training program for employers. But the problem far exceeds our capacity to address it directly, so we welcome forums like this one, which can make an impact on employers and employees alike to recognize and address sexual harassment in the workplace. Thank you, and have a good evening.
Jill Zincraft, Executive Director, Domestic Abuse and Sexual Assault Crisis Center.
Good evening. I'd like to thank Ywca and the New Jersey Division on Civil Rights for hosting tonight's forum and allowing me the opportunity to speak to all of you in regard to the issues surrounding sexual harassment and housing in the workplace. My name is Jill Zincraft, and I'm the Executive Director of the Domestic Abuse and Sexual Assault Crisis Center of Warren County, DASAC for short. DASAC is a free and confidential multi-system agency that responds to the needs of those impacted by interpersonal violence, including crisis intervention and emergency shelter. I've held this position as of June 2013. However, I've been working and volunteering in the field of interpersonal violence for over 3 decades. I also serve and have the honor on the Board of Trustees as the chair for Ywca. So by virtue of working in this field, I carry with me a lifetime of stories of those impacted by sexual violence. We often become the keeper of those stories, and I'm here to tell you that there are many. In both my personal and professional experience, it is very rare to meet a woman who, at one or more points in her life, felt that a man was entitled to access her body without her permission. Almost every single one. Over the last couple of years, tens and thousands of women have shared their stories of sexual harassment, sexual assault, in person and online, with the hopes of bringing awareness and being part of the change agents. The prevalence of sexual violence in Warren County, which I'm including sexual harassment, mimics the statistics throughout the state and in the country. The Me Too movement is once again highlighted what those of us who work in this field have always known to be true. That we work and live within a culture that is ideologically comfortable with misogyny and acts of violence. How else can we explain those statistics that were read at the beginning? I stand before all you tonight as an advocate, administrator, colleague, and I can touch briefly upon my own experiences of sexual harassment I've encountered just in the last few years. I'm going to speak at this point on in generalities. I happen to be a private person, so I share it not to draw attention to myself, but to highlight that even those of us working in the field are not immune to these behaviors. In fact, I would argue that it often escalates it. Please know that it is very rare that someone who meets me does not know what I do for a living. So I am saying that these behaviors are purposeful. At an agency fundraiser not long ago, I was standing behind the check-in table with other staff members greeting our guests. One of our guests, also a donor, threw down a $100 bill in front of me and asked, "How much time does this money buy me with you?" He then proceeded into the fundraiser, and I was left to clean up that mess with the staff who could not understand why at a fundraiser that is raising money and awareness about the issues surrounding violence against women was their executive director just referred to as a prostitute. In another instance, I was part of a very small 50-50 at a business meeting in which I had the winning ticket. I was sitting at the table with 20 other people, and the person who was in charge of the money threw it across the table at me and laughed and said, "Now you get to dance for it." I've been grabbed, groped, and hugged just a little too tightly. I have felt dirty, ashamed, frightened for my safety, but mostly I feel angry. I've been told that I should take these comments as a compliment, or that I need a better sense of humor. I've been asked, why didn't I stand up for myself? Or when I do speak my truth to power, I've been told to relax or chill out or just walk away. I've been given advice such as, don't go back there again, or the next time you go back there, bring your husband. And I've been questioned about why I allowed it to happen. Or maybe next time I'll learn from my mistakes and I'll do it differently. Maybe it was the way I was dressed. And while this has everything to do with me, it has nothing to do with me. And of course, this is just a very small snapshot of what I've experienced. And my story is shared by many. The only thing that separates me from all DASAC's clients is just a moment of time. Born on a certain day in a certain place, right time, wrong place, it doesn't matter. The women who seek out the services at DASAC and other sister agencies' experiences are very complicated. By the time a woman seeks our services, the violence has moved past harassment, and now we categorize it as abusive. And please know that I've changed some of the minor details about what I'm about to share. And I've pulled these examples from many, many years to maintain anonymity. And I also want to acknowledge that this may be hard for you to hear. Client A was a migrant, undocumented worker who worked for a couple of years as a laborer before she became the target of a new supervisor. In order for her to collect her money on payday, which, by the way, she needed to support her children, she was told that she would have to perform oral sex. Frightened and not knowing where to turn, she thought if she just did it this one time, he would leave her alone. However, this continued for approximately 6 months, and the violence escalated before, during, and after each sexual assault, until he had hurt her in a way that required immediate medical attention. And she took herself to the hospital. She found her way to shelter, where she stayed with her children while she healed. She knew that her options for her and her children were limited, and after months at a shelter, she made the difficult decision to return to that job. She would do anything to keep her children. Client B was a woman living and working within her community when her building was sold, and she inherited a new landlord. This client was recovering from addiction and had a long history of childhood sexual trauma. The conversation with the landlord started as a friendly interaction, and he would come to her apartment at the end of the day to visit, and she loved the company, and she felt safe with him. They developed a friendship and chatted often. Eventually, that led to sharing a bottle of wine occasionally turned into every night, and soon the client's addiction spiraled. One night, when the client was not comfortable with the advances from the landlord, she asked him to leave, and he refused, stating that he knew she wanted it. The violence that followed took place over the course of the next 11 hours. She woke the next morning and found herself in a bathtub after being knocked unconscious. She did not press charges. She did not seek out medical attention immediately, but she called the hotline for help. During her stay at shelter, she healed her physical wounds, but the emotional toll it took on her was devastating, resulting in the loss of her employment, housing, sobriety, mental health, and her friendships. I highlight these cases to call attention to the complex issues of poverty, trauma, and the lack of supportive structures, because most sexual assault survivors do not have access to emergency shelter. I am grateful to all of you for giving people the opportunity to share their experiences. This is not the first time survivors have been asked to come forward to testify. However, please know that the two women I referenced above would never have come forward because the consequences would have been too great, and both were afraid for their lives. I remember the testimonies of the women in the 70s sharing their stories of abuse, assault, and harassment. We continue to stand up, raise our hands or fists, break the silence, say "me too," and I suspect we will do so until the violence stops. As I have watched the many stories unfold, I cannot help but think, how many more must come forward to prove that this is an issue before we enact real, meaningful institutional change? What we have done in the past is not working, and it is now time to try something different. I'm asking that we be bold, challenge the status quo, and work towards accomplishing the following. 1, address at all levels the cultural norms that tolerate harassment by setting policy and making it clear that sexual harassment, as well as all forms of harassment, are unacceptable and will not be tolerated. 2, develop codes of conduct that are not generic or check an insurance's liability box, but rather developed and written by the people that have been impacted and disenfranchised. And 3, develop and invest in comprehensive statewide education that is meaningful and include topics that are inclusive, respectful, and trauma-informed, and address all forms of harassment, including race, age, sexual orientation, and economic, just to name a few. Additionally, and we've heard this throughout tonight, we should be addressing the intersectionality of all the above. And number 4, we need to create environments of healing and support safe reporting practices that allow for expeditious review, decision-making, and accountability. I know we can do better. Thank you.
And Nicole Morella from the New Jersey Coalition to End Domestic Violence.
Good evening. Thank you to the division and for Ywca for holding this event and for sponsoring these hearing sessions across the state, and also for demonstrating what true collaboration can look like and the efforts that are really needed to change the course of action in our state. My name is Nicole Morella, and I represent the New Jersey Coalition to End Domestic Violence. We are a statewide advocacy organization that includes a membership of 31 domestic violence organizations across New Jersey. We work to fulfill our mission to end domestic violence through advocacy, training, technical assistance, and raising the public's awareness about domestic violence and the ways we can work together to enhance our responses and prevent domestic violence in New Jersey, stopping it before it starts. At NJCEDV, we know that ending domestic violence is only possible when all people are free from oppression, injustice, and violence. Therefore, we have embraced this vision as our guide as we work collectively and collaboratively to ensure that every system embraces a culture that no longer tolerates violence and abuse in any form. Safe and equitable workplaces, schools, and safe permanent housing are critical to the safety and security of victims of domestic violence and their children. We hear from many survivors on our helplines and even in our own office on our legal services helpline from many survivors who are not only experiencing abuse from their partners at home, but are leaving home to go to workplaces where it is also unsafe for them. In New Jersey, we've made strides in recent years to pass legislation that has increased the resources and tools available to survivors of domestic violence, like Earned Sick Leave Act, expanded paid family leave, both of which allow survivors to have better options and preventing them from having to choose between leaving and staying safe or their job security. But creating safe work environments is necessary if we want to ensure that survivors actually have access to these benefits and these resources. Workplaces, schools, and other places of public accommodation must be access points for survivors to be able to get information and support, especially when it's not safe for them to do so in their personal lives. We also must remember that offenders of domestic and sexual violence are employees too. And so we must make sure that not only are those places, workplaces, schools, and other places of public accommodation, places where we can hold them accountable, but we can also increase access to the services that are available in the community for them to help change their behaviors. We also must make sure that workplace domestic violence policies include trauma-informed training for employers and human resource officers and seek to increase equity in the workplace while also ending institutionalized racism, discrimination, and oppression. And finally, safe and affordable housing is the greatest need survivors have in New Jersey. In fact, 73% of New Jersey advocates identified safe permanent housing as the greatest unmet need survivors face in our state. And aside from the severe lack of housing available, survivors of domestic violence often find themselves vulnerable to other forms of abuse, including sexual harassment and violence, as just reported and stated through other testimony. We must not ignore the other fact that the intersection of domestic violence and homelessness is compounded for women of color and LGBTQ survivors, which limits their access to safe housing and increases their risk for further violence and abuse. The Division of Civil Rights, along with our other state partners, can be instrumental in sharing a unified message that violence and abuse in any form will not be tolerated. The Division and our state partners can be instrumental in helping to create systems and communities that hold offenders accountable and create access points for survivors to obtain the support and resources they need to keep themselves and their children safe. And NJCEDV certainly lends our support in any way that we can through this collaboration. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Is there anyone else who wanted to provide remarks who was not on the list to do so? Okay, so then thank you so much to everyone who has shared their stories tonight. It is an incredible amount of bravery and courage that is required in order to share a personal story in such an incredibly public way that is not intended to achieve any benefit to the person coming forward, and instead is only intended to make other people's lives better and to help lead to change on a broader level for others. So thank you so much to everyone who came and shared their stories tonight. I also want to thank all of the advocates who came tonight, who work on behalf of those who shared their stories. As a former advocate myself, I know that oftentimes advocates end up carrying the burdens of those that they work with, even outside of work hours, even once the client has moved on and has hopefully achieved some form of justice. So thank you to so much for all of the advocates who are carrying that burden day in and day out, who are bringing these types of cases and who are trying to work for change for everyone and not just for their clients. Thank you also to our partners who were instrumental in planning and executing these events, to Ywca, to Patricia Teffenhart, to Robert Barron, to Aaron Potenza, without whom none of these events would have been possible. And to the Rutgers International Human Rights Clinic, and to Director Penny Benitez, who shared her personal story with us today. Thank you so much, and we really look forward to working with you all on the report as well. And then I just want to say thank you to my colleagues at DCR. I only started at the Division on Civil Rights a little bit less than a year ago, but I am so incredibly lucky to work with so many people who are passionate about the cause of equal rights for all New Jersey residents and who are committed to that work and to that vision even outside of general working hours, and who are spending time away from their families in order to be here with us tonight. So thank you so much to everyone from DCR. I especially want to thank Elise Olgan from our office, who has planned every single detail of these hearings. She probably spoke to many of you, if not all of you, on the phone. She emailed with you perhaps hundreds of times. She coordinated details from making sure the tablecloth ended up here to having interpreters at our last hearing. Literally every single tiny detail was coordinated by Elise, so thank you so much. And I feel very strongly that government needs to lead the way on this issue. So thank you so much to all of you for coming out and for helping us to do that. We will be hosting a hearing tomorrow night in Atlantic City, and then we are also accepting written comments on our website. It is njcivilrights.gov/hearings, or by email to forums@njcivilrights.gov. We will consider all written and oral comments before issuing our final report. Thank you so much. Did I not thank Patricia Perkins August